They thought the Black Widow was alone because the man who once protected that farm was buried beneath the old oak tree, but before the night was over, every biker who crossed her gate would learn that Thomas Brooks had left something far more dangerous than a memory behind. The first engine roared across the Georgia backroad a little after midnight, low and mean, rolling through the darkness like thunder looking for a place to strike. Then came another, and another, until the quiet fields of Brooks' farm trembled under the growl of motorcycles. Inside the farmhouse, Evelyn Brooks opened her eyes before the first headlight touched her window. She did not scream. She did not rush for the phone. She simply sat up in the narrow bed where she had slept alone for 11 months, listening as the iron gate at the end of her driveway rattled under the weight of men who had mistaken grief for weakness. Outside, Caleb Mercer, the man they called Grim, raised one gloved hand and laughed as two of his riders cut the chain from the gate. Sparks jumped in the dark. The lock fell into the dirt. Behind him, a dozen members of the Iron Vultures rolled onto the property as if the land already belonged to them, their headlights sweeping over the barn, the pasture fence, the white farmhouse, and the small wooden sign that still read Brooks Farm in Thomas's careful hand-painted letters. Caleb killed his engine near the front porch and swung one boot onto Evelyn's flower bed, crushing the marigolds she had planted the week after the funeral. "Wake up, Mrs. Brooks," he shouted, his voice carrying across the yard. "Time to accept reality." One of his men laughed and kicked the porch steps. Another lifted his phone, recording the whole thing like a trophy. The front door opened before they could knock. Evelyn stepped onto the porch wearing her late husband's faded navy sweatshirt over her nightgown, a flashlight in one hand and her house keys in the other. She was 58, slender, tired around the eyes, with silver threaded through her braids and a stillness in her posture that made the younger bikers hesitate without knowing why. Caleb saw only an older black woman standing alone. On land he wanted. "You got 24 hours, he said, pointing toward the fields. "Sign the papers, take the money, and get out. Your husband's gone. Nobody's coming to save you now." The yard went quiet except for the ticking of hot engines. Evelyn looked at the broken gate, the men blocking her driveway, the phone camera pointed at her face, and then at the porch light glowing above them all. She did not beg. She did not step back. Her silence was not fear. It was the last mercy they were ever going to receive. "Mr. Mercer," she said softly, "you should hope nobody's coming." Caleb grinned, mistaking the warning for an old woman's pride. What he did not know was that every word he had just said was being recorded, every license plate had already been captured, and somewhere beyond the tree line, a promise made by 5 former Navy SEALs to a dying man had just awakened in the dark. 3 days before the engines came growling up her driveway, Evelyn Brooks had started her morning the same way she had started almost every morning since Thomas passed, before sunrise, before the first truck rolled down County Road 16, before the rest of Blackridge had decided what kind of day it wanted to become. At 5:15, the old alarm clock on Thomas's side of the bed clicked softly, and Evelyn opened her eyes to the pale blue darkness of the room. For a moment, she stayed still, listening to the quiet. Not an empty quiet, but the kind of quiet she had learned to respect. The refrigerator humming in the kitchen. The wind pressing gently against the window screen. The faint movement of the horses in the barn 200 yards behind the house. Then she reached across the bed, touched the folded edge of Thomas's navy sweatshirt, and whispered, "Morning, Tom." She did not say it for drama. She said it because 32 years of marriage did not end just because a doctor signed a paper and a preacher spoke beside an open grave. Brooks Farm was not large by the standards of the wealthy developers circling the county, but to Evelyn it was a whole world. 40 acres of pasture, a small vegetable garden, a red barn with a roof Thomas had patched himself, 3 horses, 12 chickens, 2 old pecan trees, and the white farmhouse they had painted together the first summer they owned it. The mortgage had been paid off for 6 years. The taxes were current. Every fence post, every water line, every worn plank on the porch carried a piece of their life. Evelyn knew people in town saw a widow when they looked at her now. They saw a black woman in her late 50s living too far from the main road, driving an aging pickup, buying feed in cash, and carrying her own groceries instead of asking for help. Some looked at her with pity. Some looked at her like she was standing in the way of progress. Evelyn noticed all of it, but she never let it change the way she moved through the world. She washed her face, braided her silver-streaked hair, pulled on jeans, work boots, and a faded denim jacket, then walked through the house checking what Thomas used to call the morning line. Front door locked. Back door secure. Kitchen window latched. Porch camera blinking red. Barn camera connected. Driveway sensor active. He had never taught her to be afraid. He had taught her to pay attention. By 6 o'clock, Evelyn was in the barn measuring grain into 2 metal buckets while the horses shifted patiently in their stalls. Jasper, the older chestnut, nudged her shoulder with his nose, and Evelyn gave him the half-smile she saved for creatures that did not lie. "You know the rules," she said softly. "No breakfast until you stop acting like you own this place." The horse huffed, and she laughed for the first time that morning. She fed them, checked their water, ran her palm along the fence rail to feel for splinters, then walked the west pasture with a small notebook in her jacket pocket. Where other people saw grass and mud, Evelyn saw details. A tire track that had not been there yesterday. A fresh bend in the wire near the county road. A cigarette but caught in the weeds beside the outer fence. She did not panic. She took a photograph with her phone, marked the place in her notebook, and kept walking. That was how Thomas had trained her after his final deployment, not with fear, but with habits. "Trouble announces itself early," he used to say. Most people ignore the announcement. Thomas Brooks had been many things to many people. To the church, he had been the quiet man who fixed the heater every winter and never let the pastor pay him. To the children on neighboring farms, he had been the tall man who let them sit on the tractor and taught them how to hold a hammer safely. To Evelyn, he had been the man who remembered how she liked her coffee, who danced badly in the kitchen, who carried grief in his shoulders but never brought war into their home unless a nightmare pulled it from him. The framed photographs in the hallway showed only pieces of him. Thomas in a dark suit on their wedding day. Thomas holding a newborn calf in the barn. Thomas smiling beside Evelyn at a county fair. The one photograph she kept in his office was different. 6 men stood together in a desert-colored world, younger than, leaner, eyes narrowed against hard sunlight. Thomas was in the center, one arm around a man named Jack Holloway, both of them covered in dust and wearing the exhausted faces of men who had survived something they would never explain at dinner tables. Evelyn rarely looked at that photograph for long. Not because she was ashamed of it, but because it belonged to a door Thomas had closed when he came home. After chores, she drove 8 miles into town in her blue Ford pickup, the one with a cracked dashboard and Thomas's old parking pass still tucked above the visor. At Miller's Feed and Hardware, she bought chicken scratch, fence staples, and a new latch for the back gate. The young cashier, Heather, smiled too brightly and asked if Evelyn needed help loading the bags. Evelyn thanked her and said she could manage. She lifted the first 50-pound bag with steady hands, not fast, not showing off, just with the practiced balance of someone who had worked land long enough to know where her strength lived. Near the front window, 2 men in leather vests stopped talking when she passed. One of them had a winged vulture patch sewn across his back. Evelyn did not stare, but she caught the reflection in the glass, the way his eyes followed her receipt, then her truck, then the road she took out of town. She filed it away. At the diner, she picked up a cup of black coffee for Mr. Walter Hayes, her nearest neighbor, an 81-year-old retired mail carrier whose knees had gotten worse since spring. She found him on his porch, arguing with a radio that had not worked right since the previous year. "You spoil me, Mrs. Brooks," Walter said, taking the cup. "Somebody ought to," Evelyn replied. He looked past her toward the road, where a motorcycle had slowed near the bend before moving on. His smile faded. "You been having visitors?" Evelyn followed his gaze, then looked back at him with the same calm Thomas had always admired. Not visitors, she said. Just men who have not decided how much trouble they want. Walter shifted uneasily. You call the sheriff if they come around. Evelyn nodded, though both of them knew sheriff's deputies in Blackridge had a habit of arriving after powerful men had already left. Back at the farm, she unloaded the feed, repaired the latch, watered the garden, and placed fresh flowers beneath the oak tree where Thomas was buried. The grave marker was simple, because that was what he had wanted. Thomas Brooks. Husband. Friend. United States Navy. Evelyn knelt there for a while, brushing dust from the stone with her sleeve. There are men watching the place, she said quietly. I know you would tell me not to borrow fear from tomorrow, so I am not. I am just telling you. The afternoon light softened across the fields. Somewhere near the barn, the porch camera clicked as it shifted angle. In Thomas's office, behind a row of old service manuals, a locked wooden box waited exactly where he had left it. Evelyn had not opened it in nearly a year. She did not need to. Not yet. She rose from the grave, squared her shoulders, and looked down the long driveway toward the gate. Anyone passing by would have seen only a widow standing alone on her farm. They would have missed the steady eyes, the careful notes, the cameras, the locked box, and the quiet discipline of a woman who had spent half her life loving a man who prepared for storms long before the clouds arrived. Caleb Mercer had not been born powerful, but by the time he was 46, he had learned how to make a whole town behave as if he were. In Blackridge, people lowered their voices when his motorcycles passed. Store owners watched their windows instead of meeting his eyes. Farmers changed the subject when his name came up at church suppers. Nobody called him mayor, nobody called him sheriff, and nobody would have admitted they were afraid of a man who spent most afternoons drinking coffee outside a repair garage with an oil-stained vest and a silver skull ring on his right hand. But fear did not need an office. It only needed repetition. The Iron Vultures had spent years teaching Blackridge what happened when someone told them no. It started small, always small enough to be explained away. A mailbox knocked over on a rainy night. Fence wire cut along the back pasture. A fuel tank mysteriously emptied. A truck window found cracked in the morning. A dog let loose from a yard. A business owner warned that insurance could get expensive if accidents kept happening. Caleb never admitted to anything directly. He did not have to. He had built his power on implication, on the half-smile after bad news, on the way his riders parked outside a diner until a man changed his mind, on the way a deputy would shrug and say there was no proof. The garage they used as their clubhouse sat at the edge of town beside an abandoned tire shop, its metal siding rusted red and gray, its gravel lot crowded with motorcycles, pickup trucks, and men who wore intimidation like a uniform. A faded sign over the roll-up door said Mercer Custom Cycles, but everyone in Blackridge knew more than motorcycles passed through that place. Deals were made there. Threats were planned there. Men with clean hands came through the back office and left Caleb to dirty the rest. On the wall behind his desk hung a county map marked with colored pins. Green pins meant land already sold. Yellow meant owners still negotiating. Red meant problems. Brooks' farm had been red for almost 2 years. Caleb stood in front of that map on a humid Thursday afternoon, tapping the red pin with the back of a pocketknife while 3 of his riders lounged around the room. One old woman, he said, not turning around. 40 acres right on the Blackridge access road, half a mile from the lake, and she thinks she can hold up a $40 million development. The men chuckled because Caleb expected them to. He liked his anger to have an audience. On the desk behind him sat a folder from Blackridge Land Partners, a company with a polished logo, a downtown Atlanta mailing address, and the kind of lawyers who never appeared in rooms like that unless they needed men like Caleb. Inside the folder were purchase offers, county surveys, zoning plans, and a private agreement that never mentioned threats, harassment, or pressure. It simply called Caleb a local acquisition consultant. The words made him laugh every time. Acquisition consultant sounded better than hired bully. It sounded legal. It sounded like something a judge might skim past if nobody looked too closely. Caleb had not always been this careful. Years earlier, he had been just another loud man on a motorcycle, picking fights outside bars and chasing respect he had never earned. His father had been the same kind of man, violent in language, weak in character, convinced that the world owed him obedience because he could scare people smaller than himself. Caleb grew up learning that if you pushed hard enough, most people stepped back. If you lied loudly enough, the truth got tired. If you wrapped your cruelty in the right flag, the right handshake, the right friendly drink with the right deputy, people started calling you misunderstood instead of dangerous. By the time the Iron Vultures formed, Caleb had refined that lesson into a business model. They targeted people with something to lose and no one powerful enough to defend them. Elderly landowners. Immigrant shopkeepers. Single mothers with overdue bills. Retired farmers whose children had moved away. People who could be made to feel alone before the first real threat was even spoken. To Caleb, Evelyn Brooks fit the pattern perfectly. A black widow outside town limits. No children living nearby. No brother parked on the porch. No husband standing between her and the gate. In Caleb's mind, she was not a person protecting a home. She was an obstacle with a pulse. Across the room, Luke Tanner leaned against a workbench and stared at the red pin on the map. He was the youngest member of the group, 23, eager, nervous, still new enough to confuse cruelty with courage. "I heard her husband was military," Luke said. The room quieted just enough for Caleb to notice. Caleb turned slowly, his gray eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his cap. "You heard that where?" Luke shrugged. "My uncle used to deliver propane out that way." Said Thomas Brooks was Navy. Maybe more than regular Navy. One of the older riders, Mason Pike, snorted from a cracked leather chair. "Her husband is in the ground, kid." Caleb smiled at that, pleased someone had said the ugly part for him. He walked to the desk, lifted the folder, and tossed it open. A photograph of Brooks' farm slid across the wood. White house. Red barn. Tree line. Pasture. A small oak near the east field. "Dead men do not protect land," Caleb said. "Living men do. And I do not see any living men standing around that widow." The others laughed again, louder this time, but Luke did not. Caleb saw the hesitation and stepped closer, lowering his voice into the tone that made people want to agree with him before they understood why. "You think a woman like that is going to fight us? She is tired. She is grieving. She is probably sitting in that house talking to photographs and pretending the world is not moving on without her. All she needs is pressure. Not a war. Pressure." He tapped the photograph once. "Pressure breaks people." That was the lie Caleb told himself whenever he chose a weaker target. He called it pressure when he meant fear. He called it business when he meant theft. He called it progress when he meant taking from people who could not afford lawyers fast enough to stop him. And for a long time, the lie had worked. 2 years before, he had forced a retired mechanic named Earl Dawson to sell 5 acres after Earl's garage burned under suspicious circumstances. The report called it an electrical failure, even though everyone knew Earl had rewired the building the previous month. The year after that, a black couple who owned a bait shop near the lake sold and moved to Alabama after weeks of broken windows and late-night engine revving outside their apartment. Deputy Harland had written every complaint in the same bored handwriting, then filed them somewhere no one would ever read. Caleb trusted men like Harland more than he trusted his own riders. A rider might panic. A deputy with a mortgage and a gambling habit could be managed. Harland did not wear an Iron Vulture's patch, but he had accepted enough favors to understand which calls deserved a slow response. That was how Caleb's power worked. Not through one big act everyone could condemn, but through many small failures nobody wanted to challenge. A missing report. A delayed patrol. A witness who suddenly decided she had seen nothing. A county official who approved a permit too quickly. A local paper that printed the words economic development without asking who had been pushed out first. Caleb knew he did not need to own the law. He only needed the law to look away at the right moments. Later that afternoon, a black luxury sport utility vehicle pulled into the gravel lot, its polished body looking out of place among the motorcycles and rusted trucks. A man in a blue dress shirt stepped out, careful not to get dust on his shoes. His name was Preston Vale, regional director for Blackridge Land Partners, and he carried himself like someone who believed dirt was something other people handled. Caleb met him near the office door. "She still has not signed," Preston said, skipping the greeting. Caleb looked toward the road, then back at him. "She will. The investors are getting impatient." "Then tell the investors impatience costs extra." Preston's jaw tightened. He disliked being reminded that he needed Caleb. Men like Preston preferred their violence hidden behind contracts, not standing in front of them wearing leather and smelling like gasoline. Still, he opened his briefcase and removed a sealed envelope. Caleb took it without looking inside. He already knew what kind of encouragement it contained. "No headlines," Preston said. "No police attention. No scenes we cannot explain." Caleb smiled thinly. "You hired me because I know how to scare people without leaving." Fingerprints. Preston glanced at the map through the open office door. His eyes settled on the red pin. "This one matters." Caleb followed his gaze. "Then this one gets handled." By sunset, the Iron Vultures had their plan. First, Caleb would visit Evelyn in daylight with a low offer and a polite voice, just enough civility to say he tried. When she refused, as he expected she would, the real pressure would begin. A damaged fence. A blocked delivery. A rumor in town that the widow was unstable. A visit at night to remind her how far she lived from help. Caleb had used the sequence before. People always thought they would stand firm until the world around them became uncomfortable. Until sleep disappeared. Until neighbors stopped visiting. Until the property they loved began to feel like a place under siege. What Caleb did not understand, because men like him rarely understood anything they could not threaten, was that Evelyn Brooks had already survived the worst night of her life when she held Thomas's hand and listened to his breathing fade. Compared to that, a man on a motorcycle was just noise. But Caleb had not learned that yet. As he pinned a fresh red marker into the map over Brooks' farm, he believed he was preparing to break a lonely widow. He believed his riders, his money, his deputy, and his reputation would be enough. He believed the town would do what it always did, watch from behind curtains and stay quiet. And most of all, he believed Thomas Brooks had taken every secret, every ally, and every dangerous promise with him to the grave. That belief would become the first mistake Caleb Mercer could not bully his way out of. Caleb Mercer chose Sunday afternoon because he knew exactly what he was doing. People in Blackridge were either at church, at lunch, or watching football with the blinds half closed, and that made the road to Brooks' farm feel quieter than usual. Quiet suited him. Quiet made intimidation easier to dress up as business. He arrived just after 2 o'clock in a black pickup instead of on his motorcycle, with Mason Pike in the passenger seat and Luke Tanner riding in the back, both of them wearing Iron Vultures vests but pretending. This was nothing more than a friendly visit. Caleb had even brought paperwork in a clean brown envelope, the kind used by lawyers and real estate agents, because men like him understood that cruelty sounded less criminal when it came folded beside a purchase offer. Evelyn saw the truck before it reached the bend. She was on the front porch shelling peas into a white enamel bowl, her boots planted flat on the painted boards, a glass of iced tea sweating on the small table beside her. The afternoon was warm, nearly 86 degrees, and the air smelled like cut grass and horse feed. Jasper grazed near the west fence. A blue jay argued from the pecan tree. Nothing about Evelyn's posture changed when the truck turned into her driveway, but her eyes followed it from the gate to the house, measuring speed, distance, number of men, license plate, and attitude. Thomas used to say a vehicle could tell you a man's intentions before his mouth did. This one stopped too close to the porch. Caleb stepped out first, smiling like a man who wanted witnesses to remember his teeth instead of his threat. He wore a pressed black shirt under his leather vest, dark jeans, polished boots, and a silver skull ring that flashed whenever he moved his hand. Mason climbed out slower, broad and heavy, chewing gum with his arms folded. Luke stayed near the truck, glancing at the barn camera without knowing he had already been recorded from 3 angles. Evelyn placed one more pea into the bowl, wiped her fingers on a dish towel, and stood. "Afternoon," she said. Her voice was calm enough to make the greeting sound like a boundary. Caleb removed his sunglasses and looked past her at the farmhouse, then the barn, then the fields beyond, as if inspecting merchandise that had been delivered late. "Mrs. Brooks," he said. "Caleb Mercer. We spoke briefly in town a while back. I remember who you are." "Good. Then this should not take long." He climbed the first porch step without being invited. Evelyn's gaze dropped to his boot, then returned to his face. "You can speak from there." Mason chuckled under his breath. Caleb paused, and for half a second the smile thinned. Men like him heard disrespect in any sentence that did not make room for them. Still, he stepped back down, pretending it had been his choice. "Fair enough. I am here on behalf of interested buyers. Serious buyers. People who can make your life easier." He lifted the brown envelope. "This is a very generous offer for land that is, frankly, becoming difficult for a woman in your position to maintain." Evelyn did not reach for the envelope. "My position?" Caleb gave a soft laugh, the kind meant to sound sympathetic and insulting at the same time. "Come on now. You are out here alone. 40 acres, aging equipment, livestock, taxes, repairs. That is a lot for anyone, especially after losing your husband. No shame in admitting when it is time to move on." "I have moved forward," Evelyn said. "That is different from moving out." Mason's gum stopped moving for a moment. Luke looked at the gravel. Caleb tilted his head, still smiling, but his eyes sharpened. "That sounds nice. But sentiment does not fix roofs. Sentiment does not pay county assessments when developers start improving the area around you. Progress is coming whether you like it or not." He held the envelope a little higher. "Best to get paid before progress leaves you behind." Evelyn looked at the envelope as if it were something the wind had blown onto her porch. "Brooks Farm is not for sale." Caleb sighed, performing patience. "You have not even looked at the number." "The number does not matter." "Every number matters." "Not this one." The porch seemed to settle into silence. Somewhere behind the barn, a horse shifted against a gate. Caleb took one step closer, not onto the porch this time, just close enough to make the space feel smaller. "Mrs. Brooks, I am trying to be respectful." Evelyn's expression did not change. "Then continue." Mason let out a short laugh before catching Caleb's look and going quiet. Caleb's jaw worked once. He glanced toward the front window, where a framed photograph of Thomas and Evelyn sat on a narrow table just inside the house. Thomas in a dark suit, Evelyn in a blue dress, both of them laughing at something outside the camera's reach. Caleb stared at it too long. "Your husband was a practical man, from what I hear." Evelyn's hand tightened slightly around the dish towel, the only sign the words had touched anything. "You did not know my husband." "Maybe not. But I know men. A man does not want his wife struggling over dirt after he is gone." Evelyn's eyes lifted slowly to his. "This dirt fed us. This dirt paid our bills. This dirt gave him peace when the rest of the world could not." Caleb's smile vanished and returned in a colder shape. "Peace is expensive. So is greed." For the first time, Caleb stopped pretending. The air changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that Luke shifted his weight by the truck. Caleb lowered the envelope and tapped it against his palm. You know, stubbornness can be dangerous out here. Long drive to town. Bad cell service. Things break. Animals get loose. People fall. A woman alone should be careful about making enemies she does not need. Evelyn heard the threat. She also heard the mistake inside it. He truly believed loneliness was measured by how many people he could see standing behind her. She turned her head slightly toward the driveway, then back to Caleb. I do not need enemies, Mr. Mercer. But I do not run from them either. Mason stepped forward. You might want to watch your tone. Evelyn looked at him, not sharply, not fearfully, just directly enough to make him remember he had not been invited. You are standing on my property. Caleb raised one hand, stopping Mason, but the damage was already done. His men had seen an older black widow correct him, refuse his offer, and hold his gaze without flinching. In Caleb's world, that could not go unanswered. He moved to the edge of the porch and placed the envelope on the top step, carefully, deliberately, as if leaving behind a final warning. Keep it, he said. Read it when pride stops speaking for you. Evelyn did not pick it up. Take it with you. Caleb's nostrils flared. You are making this harder than it has to be. No, she said. I am making it clear. A breeze moved across the yard, lifting the corner of the envelope. Caleb looked once more through the open door at Thomas's photograph. A house full of memories can start feeling mighty empty when reality shows up. Evelyn stepped forward then, just one pace, enough for the porch boards to creak beneath her boots. Her voice stayed low, steady, and clean. My husband left more behind than memories. Caleb stared at her, then laughed because he did not understand and hated that he did not understand. To him it sounded like grief talking. To Evelyn it was the closest thing to mercy she planned to offer him. He put his sunglasses back on and turned toward the truck. Mason followed, muttering something under his breath, while Luke took one last uneasy look at the porch camera blinking red above the door. Caleb opened the driver's door, then looked back. 24 hours, Mrs. Brooks. After that, folks may stop being polite. Evelyn picked up her bowl of peas and sat back down as if the conversation had ended exactly where she expected it to. Polite men wait to be invited before stepping onto a porch, she said. Caleb's hand froze on the door handle. His face hardened, and in that instant the decision was made. Not because Evelyn had shouted. Not because she had threatened him. But because she had refused to shrink, refused to flatter his power, refused to make fear visible for his men to enjoy. As the truck backed down the driveway, dust rising behind it, Caleb looked at Brooks' farm in the mirror and no longer saw a business problem. He saw a woman who had embarrassed him. That made him reckless. That made him personal. And on the porch, Evelyn waited until the truck disappeared beyond the gate before lifting the envelope with 2 fingers, carrying it inside, and placing it unopened beneath the small camera monitor in Thomas's office, where the entire conversation had been saved in clear audio. By Monday morning, Caleb Mercer had stopped pretending this was about paperwork. The first sign came before sunrise, when Evelyn walked down to the west pasture and found the outer gate hanging crooked from one hinge, not destroyed, not enough for an insurance claim, just damaged enough to send a message. The chain had been cut cleanly and left coiled in the mud like a dead snake. 2 horses stood nervous near the far fence, their ears twitching. At every sound. Evelyn did not shout. She did not curse. She took photographs from 3 angles, checked the animals for injuries, wrote the time in her notebook, and repaired the chain with a temporary lock from the barn. Then she looked toward the county road and saw fresh tire marks in the damp shoulder, wide motorcycle tracks pressed into the earth. Her face remained calm, but her eyes changed. It was not surprise. It was confirmation. By 7:30, she had called the sheriff's office and reported the damage. Deputy Harland arrived almost 2 hours later in a patrol car dusty enough to suggest he had not rushed. He stepped out with a paper cup of coffee in one hand and a look on his face that said he already knew how little he planned to do. Evelyn met him beside the gate with her notebook open. "Somebody cut the chain between midnight and 5 this morning," she said. "There are motorcycle tracks here, here, and here. I have photographs." Harlan glanced at the gate, then at the road, then back at her. Could have been kids. Kids with bolt cutters and motorcycles. "Mrs. Brooks, I am just saying we need proof before we start accusing people." Evelyn held up her phone. "I have camera footage of headlights slowing near this entrance at 1:17 in the morning." Harlan shifted his weight, suddenly less interested. "Can you make out faces?" "No. But I can make out patches on the backs of 2 riders." He sighed like she had inconvenienced him. "That is not enough. Could be anybody wearing anything." Evelyn studied him for a moment. Thomas had taught her that men who refused to see evidence often knew exactly what it showed. "Will you take a report?" she asked. Harlan pulled a small pad from his pocket and wrote down less than half of what she said. Before leaving, he gave the same advice people always gave when they wanted the victim to become easier to manage. "Maybe you should consider settling this land issue before things get more stressful. Living alone out here, you know, it is a lot." Evelyn looked past him toward the field. "I did not call you for real estate advice, Deputy." Harlan's mouth tightened. "Just trying to help." "Then file the report." He drove away without answering. Evelyn watched the patrol car disappear, then turned and saw the porch camera blinking red from the farmhouse. Every word had been recorded. By Tuesday, the trouble moved from the fence to the town. When Evelyn drove to Miller's Feed and Hardware for replacement hinges, the conversation inside dipped the moment she entered. She felt it before she heard it, that small shift people make when rumor has arrived before the person it belongs to. Heather at the register would not meet her eyes at first. 2 men near the seed aisle pretended to inspect bags of fertilizer while listening. Evelyn walked to the counter and placed her items down. "Morning, Heather." "Morning, Mrs. Brooks." The girl's voice was too soft. Behind Evelyn, a familiar laugh rolled through the store. Caleb Mercer stood near the front window with Mason Pike and another rider named Dale Riggs, all 3 of them holding coffee cups they had not paid for yet. Caleb wore that same friendly smile, the one built to make cruelty look casual. "Well, there she is," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "The Queen of Brooks Farm herself." Evelyn did not turn right away. She counted her cash, placed it on the counter, and waited for Heather to ring up the hinges. Caleb stepped closer. "You know, folks are saying you have been making wild accusations. Calling the sheriff over every little farm mishap. That kind of thing worries people." Evelyn accepted her receipt. People should be more worried about the men causing the mishaps. Mason snorted. "There she goes again." Caleb lifted both hands like an innocent man being unfairly blamed. "See what I mean? Suspicious. Angry. Hard to reason with." He looked around the store, inviting the room to join him. "I tried to bring her a fair offer. Respectful as could be. But some folks would rather turn everything into a fight." The words were meant to paint her as difficult, unstable, ungrateful. Evelyn had heard versions of that language all her life. When a black woman set a boundary, certain people called it attitude. When she defended what belonged to her, they called it aggression. She kept her voice even. "You came to my porch uninvited and threatened me when I would not sell." Caleb's smile sharpened. "Threatened? That is a strong word. You sure grief is not making you hear things?" The store went still. Heather looked down at the register. One of the men by the seed aisle shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Evelyn folded the receipt and placed it in her purse. "My grief has not affected my hearing." Caleb leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough to make the insult feel private while still letting others catch the shape of it. Then maybe pride has affected your judgment. Evelyn looked directly at him. No, Mr. Mercer. Pride is what makes a man mistake bullying for strength. Mason's face hardened, and Dale took a step forward, but Caleb raised a hand. His cheeks had colored slightly. He had tried to humiliate her in public, and she had answered without raising her voice. That was worse than being shouted at. It made him look small. Careful, Caleb said. Small towns remember how people talk. Evelyn picked up her bag. Good. Then they should remember this. She turned toward the door, but Caleb called after her, louder this time. You keep playing tough, Mrs. Brooks. Sooner or later, that farm is going to feel awful lonely. Evelyn paused at the threshold, her hand on the glass door. She did not look back when she replied. Lonely is not the same as unprotected. Caleb watched her leave, the smile gone from his face now. In the parking lot, Luke Tanner sat on his motorcycle, helmet in his lap, having heard enough to look uneasy. Evelyn passed him without a word, placed the hinges in her truck, and drove home with both hands steady on the wheel. That afternoon, the feed delivery never came. The driver, a young man named Paul, called from a gas station 6 miles away and apologized 3 times before explaining that his supervisor had rerouted him. They said there was a road issue near your place, he told her. Some guys outside the station said your driveway was blocked. I do not know, ma'am. It felt weird. Evelyn looked out the kitchen window at her empty driveway. Was one of them wearing a black vest with a vulture patch? Paul went quiet. I should not get involved. I understand, Evelyn said gently, because fear made decent people shrink before it made them cruel. Thank you for calling. She hung up, opened a new page in her notebook, and wrote down the time, the company name, the driver's name, and the exact words he had used. Then she went to the barn and portioned the remaining feed carefully, stretching what she had another day. That evening, as the sun lowered behind the pines, she found a fresh smear of red paint across the Brooks Farm sign by the road. Not a full message, not yet. Just a long red streak across Thomas's hand-painted letters. A warning pretending to be vandalism. Evelyn stood before it with a rag and a bucket of warm water. She scrubbed slowly, refusing to rush, refusing to let anger make her careless. Mr. Walter Hayes saw her from his property and came down the shoulder with his cane tapping the gravel. Evelyn, he called, breathless by the time he reached her. You should not be out here alone. I am cleaning my sign. Walter looked at the paint, then at the road. This is Mercer. Yes. You got to let somebody help. Evelyn squeezed red water from the rag. I am trying the proper way first. Walter's eyes softened. Thomas would not have liked this. Evelyn kept scrubbing until the B in Brooks showed white again. Thomas would have told me to document everything before deciding what comes next. Walter looked toward the trees, uneasy. And what comes next? Evelyn did not answer, because a motorcycle had slowed at the bend. It rolled by without stopping, the rider's helmet turned toward them, then disappeared toward town. Walter swallowed. Evelyn dipped the rag again. The next morning, the harassment became theater. Caleb had learned that private pressure had not shaken her, so he tried embarrassment. Near noon, he and 4 riders parked outside the diner while Evelyn was inside picking up soup for Walter. The place was crowded with lunch regulars, road workers, 2 teachers from the elementary school, and Deputy Harlan sitting alone at the counter with a plate of fries. Caleb entered as if the room belonged to him. His riders spread out behind him, blocking more space than necessary. Evelyn stood near the register, waiting for the takeout bag. Caleb looked at the cashier and said, "You sure you want to serve her? Might not be able to pay once she loses that farm." A few people laughed nervously because nervous laughter was easier than courage. Evelyn turned. "I am paying cash." Caleb looked at her purse. "For now." Harlan glanced over, then looked back at his plate. Evelyn noticed. Caleb noticed her noticing. That made him bolder. "Deputy," Caleb called, "you might want to keep an eye on Mrs. Brooks. She has been acting paranoid. Taking pictures of honest people. Making accusations." Harland wiped his mouth with a napkin. "Everybody stay civil." Evelyn's voice stayed calm. "Civil would be filing my reports properly." Harland's face stiffened. Caleb smiled like he had been handed a gift. "See? Always accusing. Always making herself the victim." He stepped close enough for Evelyn to smell coffee and engine oil on his jacket. "You know what your problem is? You think being a widow makes you untouchable. You think people owe you something because your husband wore a uniform." The room went quieter. Evelyn's hands remained at her sides. "Do not speak about my husband." Caleb's eyes lit with satisfaction. He had found the place where her composure had a seam. "Why not? He is not here to object." Evelyn took one slow breath. "No. He is not." The words were simple, but the grief beneath them made even the diner's old ceiling fan seem loud. Caleb mistook that pain for weakness. "Then maybe it is time you stopped hiding behind a dead man's name." Heather, who had come in on her lunch break, covered her mouth. Walter's soup sat on the counter between them. Deputy Harland shifted but did not stand. Evelyn looked at Caleb for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was so controlled it carried farther than shouting would have. "You are working very hard to make sure everyone in this room remembers what kind of man you are." Caleb's smile flickered. Behind him, Dale Riggs lifted his phone and started recording. "Say that again," Dale said. "Let the town hear how disrespectful you are." Evelyn turned slightly toward the phone. "My name is Evelyn Brooks. I own Brooks Farm legally. I have been threatened, harassed, and denied basic police assistance. And I am standing in this diner asking every person who hears me to remember that I did not start this." No one moved. No one clapped. No one came to her defense. But several eyes shifted toward Caleb, and that was enough to make his humiliation burn. He slapped his palm lightly on the counter, not striking anyone, just making noise, enough to make the cashier flinch. "You are going to regret making speeches." Evelyn picked up Walter's soup and placed a $10 bill on the counter. "No," she said. "I usually regret staying quiet too long." She walked out slowly, with Caleb's riders parting only because staying in her path would have made them look more afraid than she was. By Thursday, they began touching the farm itself in ways meant to exhaust her. The east pasture latch disappeared. 2 fence rails were loosened. A bag of trash was dumped near the vegetable garden. Someone left a cracked beer bottle on the porch steps where Evelyn might have stepped on it in the dark. Each time, she photographed the damage, saved the camera clips, and wrote everything down. At night, headlights crawled past the property at 10, 11, midnight, 2 in the morning. Engines revved near the gate, then faded. Once, a rider threw a handful of gravel against the mailbox and sped away. Evelyn slept in short stretches, waking at every sound, but she never called Caleb, never begged, never opened the unopened envelope from the porch. Her restraint angered him more than fear would have. Fear gave men like Caleb proof of power. Evelyn gave him nothing. On Friday, the iron vultures came during daylight. 6 motorcycles stopped outside the gate, and Caleb walked up to the intercom box Thomas had installed years before. Evelyn watched from the kitchen monitor as he leaned close to the camera. "You got until Monday," he said. "After that, whatever happens out here is on you." He looked past the camera toward the barn. "Pretty animals you got. Shame when fences fail." Evelyn's hand tightened around the edge of the counter. The threat was still indirect, still wrapped in plausible denial, but it landed exactly where Caleb wanted it to. He was no longer only threatening land. He was threatening living things in her care. She pressed the intercom button. "Leave my property, Mr. Mercer." Caleb grinned up at the camera. "Or what?" Evelyn's silence stretched for 3 seconds. Then she said, "You have been warned clearly. That matters later." The grin faded. "Later?" "Yes." He looked into the lens, suddenly irritated by the calm certainty in her voice. "Lady, there is no later where this goes good for you." Evelyn released the button. On the monitor, Caleb stared for another moment, then turned away, signaling his riders to follow. Before leaving, Mason stepped off his bike and kicked the mailbox post hard enough to tilt it, while Dale recorded and laughed. The group roared away in a cloud of dust. Evelyn stood alone in the kitchen, the monitor still glowing. Her breathing was controlled, but the room around her felt smaller now. She walked to the front window and looked at the tilted mailbox, the red-streaked sign, the patched fence, the fields Thomas had loved. Every insult, every threat, every failure by the deputy, every cowardly laugh in town had been added to a debt Caleb did not know he was building. That evening, Evelyn transferred the newest camera footage to a small black hard drive. She labeled the folder by date, then paused before typing a name for the main file. For a long moment, her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Then she wrote 2 words, "For Thomas." She saved it, removed the drive, and placed it in the top drawer of his desk beside the locked wooden box she still had not opened. Outside, the farm settled into darkness. Somewhere far down the road, motorcycle engines rose and fell like a promise of more trouble. Evelyn looked at the box, then at the photograph of Thomas with the 5 men in the dust-colored world. She was still trying to do this clean. Still trying to let the law work. Still giving Caleb Mercer chances he had not earned. But the chances were running out, and every cruel thing he did was being preserved more clearly than he understood. That night, after the engines faded and the last strip of daylight disappeared behind the pines, Evelyn Brooks stood in Thomas's office with the black hard drive in one hand and the locked wooden box in front of her. The room smelled faintly of cedar, paper, and the lemon oil she still used on his desk every Saturday, even though no one sat there anymore. Everything was exactly as Thomas had left it because Evelyn had never found the courage to rearrange the shape of his absence. His reading glasses rested beside an old notebook. His service manuals lined the shelf in careful order. A chipped coffee mug from Coronado sat near the lamp, filled with pens that had long since gone dry. On the wall, the photograph of Thomas and 5 younger men watched her in silence from a desert-colored past. Evelyn placed the hard drive in the top drawer, beside the notebook where she had started documenting Caleb Mercer's visits, the damaged gate, the blocked feed delivery, the diner humiliation, the threats at the intercom, and every time Deputy Harland had treated evidence like an inconvenience. She closed the drawer halfway, then stopped. Her eyes lowered to the wooden box. Thomas had given it to her 3 weeks before the end, when his hands had already grown thinner but his voice still carried that quiet command that made people listen. He had told her the key was taped beneath the 3rd drawer of the desk. He had told her she would know when to open it. At the time, she had been too angry at the illness to understand why he was talking like a man preparing a road map for a storm she refused to imagine. Now the storm was outside her gate, wearing leather, smiling at cameras, and calling itself progress. Evelyn sat in Thomas's chair slowly. The leather sighed beneath her weight. For a long moment, she did not move. She could almost hear him from the doorway, telling her not to make decisions from fear, telling her to breathe first, think second, act third. Thomas Brooks had been the kind of man who made calm feel like shelter. Even when nightmares woke him from sleep, even when thunderstorms rolled over the roof and his eyes went somewhere far away, he never let the darkness inside him become a weapon against the woman he loved. He had spent 22 years in the United States Navy, though most people in Blackridge only knew the polite version of that truth. They knew he had served. They knew he stood when the flag passed. They knew he helped veterans fill out forms at the county office and quietly paid for repairs when someone's wheelchair ramp gave out. What they did not know was that Thomas had belonged to a world where names were often left off paper, where missions were described in language so plain it concealed their danger, where trust was not a feeling but a lifeline. Evelyn had not married a myth. She had married a man who carried groceries, burned toast, sang off-key in church, and cried the first time they lost a foal in winter. But she had also married a man whose hands never trembled under pressure, whose eyes caught movement other people missed, who could walk into a crowded room and know where every exit was before anyone offered him a chair. Over the years, he had taught her small things without making them feel like lessons. Never park where you cannot pull forward. Never ignore a vehicle that slows twice. Keep records because memory gets challenged by men with badges and money. Do not let anger pick the moment. Let truth pick it. She had laughed at some of it in the early years, calling him impossible, calling him dramatic when he checked the locks twice. Then life taught her that Thomas had not been expecting danger everywhere. He had simply learned that danger respected people who paid attention. Evelyn reached beneath the third drawer and found the small brass key exactly where he had said it would be. The tape holding it there had yellowed at the edges. She peeled it free, held the key in her palm, and felt a sudden rush of grief so sharp she had to close her eyes. Opening the box felt like admitting he had known this day might come, and part of her hated that he had been right. Outside, the barn light clicked on automatically, casting a pale glow across the yard. The house was quiet. The farm was waiting. Evelyn slipped the key into the lock. The mechanism turned with a soft metallic sound that seemed much too loud in the room. Inside the box lay a folded American flag patch, a tarnished challenge coin, a silver watch with scratches across the face, a sealed envelope with her name written in Thomas's hand, and a small black address book bound with an elastic band. Beneath them was a photograph she had never seen before. Thomas stood with the same 5 men from the picture on the wall, but this time they were older, no longer in uniform, gathered on Brooks' farm near the Red Barn. Evelyn recognized the day from the sky. It had been 3 summers earlier, during Thomas's remission, when a group of his Navy friends had visited for a barbecue and stayed late into the evening. She remembered their laughter, their careful eyes, the way they treated Thomas with a respect that felt deeper than friendship. She remembered Jack Holloway washing dishes without being asked, Marcus Reed repairing a loose barn hinge, Owen Price showing Walter Hayes how to fix his generator, Daniel Cross standing quietly near the tree line as if the woods had asked to be watched, and Ben Whitaker telling Evelyn that Thomas had once carried him farther than any man should have been able to carry another. At the time, she thought they were simply men bound by hard years. Now, looking at the photograph, she noticed what she had missed. They were not just visiting. They were learning the land. The angles of the barn. The road beyond the fence. The distance from the porch to the gate. The tree line behind the pasture. Thomas had been showing them her world. Evelyn opened the envelope with careful fingers. The letter inside was only 1 page, written in the steady hand he had kept until near the end. Eve, if you are reading this, it means I am not there to stand beside you, and someone has made you feel alone on land that belongs to us. I need you to hear me clearly. You are not weak because you ask for help. You are not dishonoring me by calling the men in this book. Every one of them is alive because someone answered when the call came. Let them answer for you. Start with Jack. Do not argue with him. Just tell him what happened. Evelyn pressed the letter against her chest and let the tears come silently, not the broken kind that had taken her after the funeral, but the quieter grief of hearing love speak from paper. Thomas had not left her instructions for revenge. He had left her permission to stop carrying the fear alone. When she could breathe again, she opened the black address book. The first page had one name, written in block letters. Jack Holloway. Under it were 2 phone numbers, one marked primary, one marked if urgent. Beside the name, Thomas had written 3 words, trust him fully. Evelyn sat for a long time with the book open, her thumb resting on the edge of the page. She thought about Caleb's voice at the gate. Pretty animals you got. Shame when fences fail. She thought about the diner, about Deputy Harland looking down at his plate, about people pretending not to hear because hearing would require something from them. She thought about the red paint on the Brooks Farm sign and the way Caleb had looked through her doorway at Thomas's photograph, as if a dead man's memory was something he could step over on his way to profit. Her hand moved to the phone before her mind finished deciding. She dialed the primary number. It rang twice. A man answered, his voice low, alert, and not fully softened by sleep. Holloway. Evelyn closed her eyes. Jack. It is Evelyn Brooks. Silence. Not confusion. Recognition. When he spoke again, the change in his voice was immediate. Evelyn, are you safe right now? The question was so direct that she almost told him she was fine out of habit. Instead, she looked at the camera monitor on Thomas's desk, showing the driveway, the barn, the dark line of trees, the broken mailbox post still leaning by the road. For the moment, she said. What happened? She told him carefully, the way Thomas would have wanted. No exaggeration. No panic. Dates, times, names, damage, threats, Deputy Harland's response, Caleb Mercer, Blackridge Land Partners, the offer she had refused, the riders at the gate. Jack did not interrupt. She heard only the faint shift of his breathing, the small click of a pen, the quiet focus of a man turning pain into information. When she finished, there was another silence. Then Jack asked, did they put hands on you? Evelyn looked down at her wedding ring. Not yet. Jack exhaled once. Then we still have time to do this clean. The words settled into the room like a door opening somewhere far away. Evelyn wiped her cheek. Thomas told me not to argue with you. For the first time, Jack's voice softened. Smartest order he ever gave. I do not want a war on my farm, Jack. Neither do I. Thomas did not ask us to bring war to your home. He asked us to keep you safe. Evelyn looked at the photograph of the 6 men on the wall, at Thomas in the center, younger and sunburned and alive. Who is us? Jack did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice carried the weight of years and promises kept in silence. The men who owe your husband our lives. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the phone, not from fear this time, but from the strange, painful relief of realizing that Caleb Mercer had been wrong from the beginning. She was not protected by a ghost. She was protected by the loyalty Thomas had earned while living. How many are coming? She asked. Jack's answer was calm, practical, almost ordinary. Enough. But listen to me, Evelyn. You keep documenting. You do not confront them alone. You do not warn Mercer about us. You let him keep thinking he is winning. Outside, the wind moved across the dark fields, bending the grass in waves. Evelyn looked at the locked gate on the monitor, then at the folder marked for Thomas. He already thinks that. Jack's voice lowered. Good. Men like that get careless when they feel powerful. Evelyn remained still for a moment, then closed the wooden box except for the letter, which she kept in her hand. And if he comes back before you get here? Jack did not raise his voice. He did not make wild promises. He simply said, then you call me and you stay where the cameras can see you. The calm in his tone reminded her so strongly of Thomas that her throat tightened again. When the call ended, Evelyn placed the address book beside the hard drive, turned off the desk lamp, and stood in the darkness of Thomas's office. Nothing outside had changed yet. The mailbox was still crooked. The gate was still damaged. Caleb still believed he had found a widow with no one left. But somewhere beyond Blackridge, phones were beginning to ring. Men who had buried parts of themselves in service to their country were waking to the name Evelyn Brooks. And for the first time in days, when Evelyn looked out over the farm, the silence no longer felt like waiting for trouble. It felt like something disciplined had started moving quietly toward it. Jack Holloway arrived in Blackridge before dawn on Saturday in a silver pickup with South Carolina plates, a cooler in the back, and the tired posture of a man who looked like he was passing through on his way to a fishing trip. Nobody at the gas station noticed him for more than a second. That was the point. He bought black coffee, a county map, and a pack of batteries, then stood by the window long enough to watch two Iron Vulture's riders roll past the pumps without helmets, laughing as if the road belonged to them. Jack did not stare. He only turned the map slightly, caught both license plates in the reflection of the glass, and sent the numbers in a short message to a group chat that had not been active in almost 11 months. By 7 o'clock, Marcus Reed had checked into the Blackridge Motor Lodge under his own name because men with nothing to hide sometimes looked less suspicious than men trying too hard. Owen Price took a table at the diner with a newspaper and a plate of eggs, listening more than he ate. Daniel Cross parked near the county courthouse and photographed public notices about zoning changes around Blackridge Lake. Ben Whitaker drove the back roads outside Brooks Farm, never crossing Evelyn's property line, simply learning the bends, the ditches, the tree cover, and the places where motorcycles could gather without being seen from the house. They were older than the men in the photograph on Thomas's wall, heavier in some places, grayer in others, with knees that remembered hard landings and shoulders that predicted rain. But their eyes still moved with the same quiet order. Nothing wasted. Nothing dramatic. No one came to play hero. They came to keep a promise cleanly enough that Evelyn Brooks could sleep in her own house when it was over. Jack did not drive to the farm until mid-morning. He stopped at the repaired gate, pressed the intercom, and lifted both hands where the camera could see them. Inside the house, Evelyn watched him on the monitor before opening the gate. He looked different from the barbecue years ago, older, more worn around the mouth, but when he stepped from the truck and removed his cap, she recognized the weight in his expression. Not pity. Respect. He walked up the porch slowly and stopped before the first step, waiting to be invited. That alone told Evelyn why Thomas had trusted him. Mrs. Brooks, he said. Evelyn, she corrected softly. Jack nodded. Evelyn. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Jack looked toward the oak tree in the east field and lowered his head. I should have come sooner. Thomas would say you came when called. Jack's jaw tightened once, the kind of grief men like him allowed themselves only in small movements. He would. Evelyn led him into Thomas's office, where the black hard drive, the notebook, the unopened envelope, and the wooden box sat on the desk in careful order. Jack did not touch anything at first. He read the room the way Thomas used to read a road. Camera monitor. Window angles. File labels. Dates in Evelyn's handwriting. The folder marked for Thomas. You have been busy, he said. I have been angry, Evelyn replied. I needed somewhere useful to put it. Jack almost smiled. He married well. Over the next hour, Evelyn walked him through everything. She played the porch recording from Caleb's first visit. She showed him the diner audio captured on her phone from inside her purse, the photographs of the damaged gate, the red paint, the tire tracks, the broken mailbox post, the feed delivery call log, and the camera clip of Caleb threatening the animals through the intercom. Jack listened without interrupting, occasionally writing a time stamp or asking for a name to be repeated. When the clip ended with Caleb saying there was no later where this went good for her, Jack sat back and looked at the frozen image of Caleb's face on the monitor. He likes hearing himself talk. Evelyn folded her hands on the desk. Is that useful? Very. By noon, the rest of the men had come one at a time, never in a group, never making the farm look like a gathering point. Marcus arrived wearing a work shirt and carrying a toolbox. Owen came with a grocery bag from Miller's, as if he were just dropping supplies for a friend. Daniel took the long way through the tree line and appeared near the barn only after Jack had told Evelyn exactly when to expect him. Ben drove in last, stopping to straighten the mailbox post before he came to the house. Evelyn watched them enter Thomas's office and felt something in her chest loosen and ache at the same time. These were not strangers, not exactly. They were pieces of Thomas's life that had survived him, men shaped by the same places that had shaped him, men who looked at his photograph the way church people looked at stained glass. Jack placed the county map on the desk and spoke with a calm that made the room feel organized. We do this in layers. First, we keep Evelyn visible and safe. Second, we preserve every threat, every trespass, every attempt to force a sale. Third, we connect Mercer to whoever is paying him. Fourth, we make sure this leaves local hands before Deputy Harland can bury it. Evelyn looked from one man to the next. I told you I do not want anyone hurt on this farm. Marcus Reed, broad-shouldered with a close gray beard, nodded from beside the bookshelf. Then we build the case so strong nobody needs to get hurt. Owen opened his laptop on Thomas's desk, careful to place a cloth beneath it as if the wood deserved respect. Daniel checked the camera system and found what Evelyn already suspected: Thomas had installed more capacity than she had ever used. There were ports for additional cameras, storage space for weeks of footage, and an old backup drive hidden behind the office shelf. He built this like he expected trouble to test it, Daniel said. Evelyn looked at the monitor. He built everything that way. By late afternoon, the farm had changed without looking changed. Marcus replaced the visible porch camera with a newer one that looked nearly identical but captured clearer audio from the driveway. Daniel mounted 2 small trail cameras along the tree line where riders had slowed before. Ben fixed a discreet lens above the barn door, angled toward the west pasture gate. Owen set Evelyn's phone to automatically upload recordings to secure cloud storage whenever it connected to the farmhouse wireless network. Jack placed a small button beneath the kitchen counter, not an alarm that screamed, but one that silently notified all 5 men and began recording from every active device. He showed Evelyn twice, then had her practice once. Only if they come onto the property or you feel unsafe, he said. Not because you are scared. Because you are ready. Evelyn touched the underside of the counter, feeling the small device. Thomas would have liked that distinction. Thomas taught me that distinction. While the farm became a quiet net of cameras and backups, Owen followed the money. He had spent 12 years after the Navy working corporate security, which meant he knew how legal wrongdoing often hid behind clean letterhead and polite phrases. Blackridge Land Partners had purchased 6 parcels around the lake in 18 months, all through separate holding companies. 3 sales happened within 30 days of reported vandalism. 2 sellers had filed complaints that went nowhere. One complaint named a motorcycle group but had been closed for lack of evidence by Deputy Harland. Owen found property records, complaint numbers, names of shell companies, and zoning applications approved with unusual speed. He sent the packet to a former federal investigator named Rachel Kim, now working financial crimes out of Atlanta, who had once been pulled out of a collapsing convoy by Thomas Brooks and had never forgotten the debt. Rachel called Jack just before sunset. Her voice came through on speaker in Thomas's office, crisp and cautious. I cannot move on biker intimidation alone, she said. But if you can connect threats to forced land sales, fraudulent acquisition, public corruption, or interstate money movement, I can open doors. Jack looked at Evelyn's files. We are building that. Build it fast. And keep your widow clean. No vigilante nonsense. Evelyn leaned toward the phone before Jack could answer. Agent Kim, my name is Evelyn Brooks. I have done everything by the book while men tried to scare me off my own land. I have no interest in nonsense. I want a record strong enough that nobody can pretend this was a misunderstanding. There was a brief silence, then Rachel's tone softened. Mrs. Brooks, that is exactly what I needed to hear. The next day, Caleb helped build the case against himself. At 10 in the morning, he called Evelyn from a blocked number. Jack sat across from her at the kitchen table, Owen beside him with headphones connected to the recording system. Evelyn answered on speaker, her voice calm. This is Evelyn Brooks. Caleb did not bother with manners. You had time to think. I have thought carefully. Then you know the smart answer. Evelyn looked at Jack. He nodded once. The farm is still not for sale. Caleb laughed, but irritation dragged at the sound. You really do not understand how alone you are, do you? Evelyn looked through the kitchen window at the barn, where Marcus was repairing a latch in plain clothes, appearing to be nothing more than a hired handyman. I understand more than you think. No, you do not. You think cameras and little notebooks make you safe. They do not. They just make people tired of your complaining. Owen's fingers moved quickly across the laptop, capturing the call metadata. Jack wrote down the exact phrasing. Evelyn kept her breathing steady. Are you threatening me again, Mr. Mercer? I am telling you reality. Monday comes, and that offer disappears. After that, bad luck gets expensive. Bad luck? Gates fail. Barns catch problems. Deliveries stop coming. Old women trip over their own stubbornness. County deputies get tired of hearing the same name. Caleb was so pleased with his own cleverness that he did not hear the trap closing around every word. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly, not from fear, but to keep anger out of her voice. You should stop calling me. I will stop when you sign. Then you will be calling a long time. Caleb's voice hardened. You should have taken the polite visit. The line went dead. Owen saved the file in 3 places before the call screen disappeared. Jack looked at Evelyn with quiet approval. You gave him room. Room for what? To show who he is. By Monday, there were witnesses Caleb did not know he had created. Paul, the feed delivery driver, agreed to give a written statement after Marcus met him at the gas station and explained that rerouting a delivery under pressure could become part of a larger investigation. Heather from the hardware store sent Evelyn a message apologizing for staying quiet and attached a short phone video she had taken from behind the register during Caleb's public humiliation. Mr. Walter Hayes wrote a statement in careful, shaky handwriting about the motorcycle that slowed while Evelyn cleaned the sign and about the nights he heard engines near the Brooks gate. Even one of the teachers from the diner, a woman named Linda Carver, called Evelyn and admitted she had recorded part of Caleb's comments because something about it felt wrong. The town had not suddenly become brave, but evidence gave frightened people a bridge to cross. Each file went into Owen's growing archive. Each statement received a date, a time, a source, and a backup. Jack insisted on discipline. Emotion gets dismissed, he told the room. Documentation gets reviewed. Evelyn repeated that line under her breath later while scanning Thomas's property deed, tax receipts, insurance papers, her marriage certificate, the mortgage release, the purchase offers, and every sheriff's office case number Harland had failed to pursue. The more paper she gathered, the less helpless she felt. Caleb had been trying to make her world feel unstable. The evidence made it solid again. On Tuesday evening, Preston Vale made his own mistake. He sent Evelyn an email from his Blackridge Land Partners account with the subject line "Final Opportunity." The message was polished, professional, and cold. It referenced community development, rising maintenance burdens, and the benefit of cooperating before outside circumstances reduced the property value. It did not threaten her directly. Men like Preston left that to men like Caleb. But attached to the email was a revised offer lower than the first, along with a proposed closing date that had already been scheduled for Friday morning, as if Evelyn's surrender were an administrative detail. Owen read the email twice and smiled without humor. There it is. Evelyn frowned. There what is? Coordination. They lowered the offer after the harassment began and scheduled closing before you agreed. That helped show pressure was part of the acquisition plan. Jack looked toward the dark window. And Mercer thinks he is just scaring a widow. Outside, the farm looked peaceful. Crickets sang from the ditches. The horses shifted in the barn. A soft wind moved through the pecan trees. But beneath that quiet, a case was forming with every timestamp and every careless word. Caleb still believed he was pushing Evelyn into a corner. He did not know the corner had cameras. He did not know his blocked calls were saved, his rider's plates were logged, his deputy's silence was documented, his financial backers were being traced, and his victims were beginning to talk. Most of all, he did not know that the men he had not seen were not waiting for a fight. They were waiting for proof. And because Caleb Mercer had never feared consequences, he was giving them exactly what they needed. Friday arrived with a heat that sat heavy over Blackridge, pressing the air flat against the fields and making every sound travel farther than it should. Evelyn felt it before noon, not as fear, but as a tightening in the rhythm of the farm. The horses stayed close to the barn instead of wandering toward the far pasture. The chickens went quiet whenever a truck passed the road. Even Mr. Walter Hayes, who usually spent afternoons on his porch arguing with the radio, had called before breakfast and told her his bad knee was acting up, which was his way of saying the neighborhood felt wrong. Evelyn spent the morning doing exactly what Jack had told her to do. She stayed visible. She stayed calm. She checked every camera without touching the angles. She carried her phone in her apron pocket and kept the small button under the kitchen counter within reach whenever she came inside. Marcus Reed repaired the loose boards on the old tack room, looking to anyone passing by like a hired handyman earning day wages. Daniel Cross was somewhere beyond. The trees where the pasture dipped toward the creek, invisible unless a person already knew how to look. Owen Price sat in town with his laptop and the evidence archive open, waiting for anything new to come in. Ben Whitaker had driven Walter to a clinic appointment that Walter suddenly needed, though Evelyn knew the timing was no accident. Jack Holloway stayed off the porch, out of sight, close enough to respond and far enough to let Caleb Mercer believe Brooks Farm was still exactly what he thought it was, one widow, one house, one signature away from surrender. Just after 3 o'clock, Preston Vale's black sport utility vehicle appeared at the gate. Evelyn saw it on the monitor before the intercom chimed. He had not come alone. Caleb's pickup idled behind him, and beyond that, 6 motorcycles waited in a loose line along the road, their riders wearing leather vests and restless smiles. Evelyn looked at the screen, then at Jack, who stood just inside Thomas's office with his arms folded. "He brought the suit this time," she said. Jack's eyes remained on the monitor. "That means they want this to look official before they make it ugly." Evelyn pressed the intercom. "State your business." Preston leaned toward the camera with a folder tucked under one arm and a smile that looked practiced in conference rooms. "Mrs. Brooks, Preston Vale with Blackridge Land Partners. We have a scheduled closing discussion today." "No, Mr. Vale. You scheduled one. I did not agree to it." Caleb stepped into view behind him, chewing on a toothpick, his expression bright with satisfaction. "Now, do not be difficult, Mrs. Brooks. We are here to help you make the smart choice." Evelyn's hand rested beside the intercom button. "You are trespassing if you come through that gate without permission." Preston's smile tightened. "We would hate to escalate a simple property matter." Jack's voice was quiet behind her. "Let them say it." Evelyn kept her tone steady. "There is no property matter. I own this farm. I have declined every offer. Leave." Caleb laughed, loud enough for the camera to catch it clearly. "Open the gate, Evelyn. Last chance to do this like a lady." For 1 second, the house went still. Evelyn did not look at Jack. She did not need to. She pressed the small button beneath the counter with her other hand, then returned her palm to the intercom as if nothing had happened. Every active camera began recording to 3 locations at once. Owen received the alert in town. Marcus stopped hammering in the barn and lowered the tool slowly. Daniel shifted in the tree line. Jack took 1 step back from the window. Evelyn looked into the monitor. "No," Caleb stared at the camera, and all the false humor drained from his face. He turned away and made a sharp gesture. Mason Pike walked to the gate with bolt cutters. Preston looked uncomfortable for the first time. "Caleb, that is not what we discussed." Caleb did not even glance at him. "You wanted results." The chain snapped and dropped against the gravel. Preston stepped back, but he did not leave. That mattered. Evelyn watched the gate swing open, watched Caleb's truck roll in, watched the motorcycles follow like a storm of chrome and noise. She picked up Thomas's letter from the kitchen table, folded it once, and placed it in her pocket before walking to the front porch. She did not lock the door behind her. Locking it would have suggested she believed the door was what protected her. Caleb stopped in the yard and climbed out with the swagger of a man performing for his own legend. Preston remained beside the sport utility vehicle, pale but present, holding the folder as if paper could make him innocent. The riders spread across the front yard and driveway, careful not to step too close to the barn where Marcus stood with a wrench in his hand, looking down from the shadowed doorway. Caleb noticed him and smirked. Hired help. Evelyn stood at the top of the porch steps. A friend repairing a latch. You always collect strays. Mason laughed. Evelyn's eyes moved across each rider, each patch, each license plate, each face. You have been told to leave. Caleb walked toward the porch with Preston following reluctantly behind. And you have been told this land is moving into development whether you cooperate or not. Mr. Vale has brought final documents. You sign today, you get paid, you get to move somewhere safer, and all this stress ends. Evelyn looked at Preston. Do you authorize these men to cut my chain and enter my property? Preston swallowed. Mrs. Brooks, I think emotions are running high. That was not my question. Caleb stepped in front of Preston, irritated by the exchange. Your question does not matter. Your answer does. He pulled a pen from the folder and held it out. Sign. Evelyn did not take it. No, it was a small word, but it landed in the yard like a locked gate. Caleb's riders shifted. Preston looked toward the road. Caleb's jaw hardened. You keep saying that like it changes anything. It changes me, Evelyn said. It keeps me honest. Caleb's face twisted with a kind of contempt he had stopped bothering to hide. Honest? You sit out here acting like some noble widow while this county grows around you. You think because your husband wore a uniform, everybody has to bow down and let you hold progress hostage. Evelyn's eyes cooled. Do not use my husband to excuse your greed. Caleb pointed the pen at her. Your husband is gone. This farm is just dirt and old wood. You are the only one pretending it is sacred. Behind him, one of the younger riders, Luke Tanner, looked toward the oak tree in the east field and seemed to understand, too late, that Caleb was stepping onto something deeper than land. Evelyn's voice stayed low. I am warning you one final time. Leave my property. Take your papers, take your men, and leave. Caleb smiled. He had been waiting for that sentence, because he mistook warnings from calm people as proof they had nothing else. Or what? Evelyn did not answer. Caleb turned toward the yard with his arms spread, playing to the riders, to Preston, to anyone who might later describe the moment. You hear that? She is warning me now. The men laughed, some more nervously than others. Caleb pointed toward the barn. Mason, check the outbuilding. Maybe Mrs. Brooks needs to see what happens when old places become unsafe. Mason started toward the barn. Marcus stepped out from the doorway, still holding the wrench loosely at his side, his expression unreadable. Building is closed. Mason stopped, not because Marcus had threatened him, but because there was something in the way the man stood that did not match a farmhand. Caleb noticed the hesitation and hated it. Leave him, he snapped. We are not here for the help. Then his eyes caught the open front door behind Evelyn. Through it, on the hallway table, Thomas's framed photograph was visible, along with the folded navy sweatshirt Evelyn had worn on cold mornings. Caleb climbed the first porch step. Evelyn moved down one step, blocking him without touching him. You do not enter my home. Caleb leaned close enough for his voice to drop. You really think you can stop anything today? Evelyn held his gaze. I think you should be careful what you do while cameras are watching. For a flicker of a second, his eyes moved to the porch camera. Then he laughed, too loudly. Cameras. Notebooks. Little widow games. He turned to Dale Riggs. Record this. I want proof we gave her every chance. Dale lifted his phone. The red dot appeared on the screen. Caleb did not understand that he had just created one more witness for her. Preston opened the folder with trembling fingers. Mrs. Brooks, if you would simply review the settlement agreement, we can all avoid any further unpleasantness. You cut my gate, Evelyn said. You brought men onto my land. You are standing beside the person who has threatened me for days. This is not a settlement. This is coercion. Preston flinched at the word, but Caleb stepped closer, crowding the bottom of the stairs. Big words do not change a small situation. He pointed toward the driveway. You are outnumbered. Evelyn looked past him, not toward Jack, not toward Daniel, not toward any of the men Caleb had failed to see, but toward the oak tree where Thomas rested. No, she said quietly. I am not. Caleb followed her gaze and saw only the tree, the small marker beneath it, and the American flag moving faintly in the hot wind. Something ugly moved across his face. He walked off the steps and toward the yard before anyone understood what he meant to do. Evelyn's body went still. Do not go near that tree. Caleb kept walking. Or what, Evelyn? The grave going to complain too? Even. Mason looked uncertain now. Luke whispered, Caleb, leave it. Caleb ignored him. He reached the oak, stood beside Thomas's marker, and looked back with a grin built from pure spite. This what all the drama is about? A stone and a flag? Evelyn came down from the porch, each step measured, her face pale with controlled anger. Step away from my husband's grave. Caleb saw that he had finally reached the part of her that hurt most, and because men like him confuse pain with victory, he pushed harder. He nudged the small flag aside with his boot, not breaking it, not destroying it, just disrespecting it enough to make the entire yard go silent. There, he said. Still just dirt. Evelyn stopped 10 feet away. Her eyes did not leave his face. You are crossing a line you cannot uncross. Caleb laughed. Lady, I crossed your line when I came through that gate. Then he turned toward the porch and saw the dark navy sweatshirt folded inside the doorway. Before Evelyn could move, he strode back, snatched it from the hallway table, and held it up in the yard like a rag. Preston said his name sharply. Caleb. Jack, inside the house and out of sight, closed his hand around the edge of the office door but did not move. Not yet. Evelyn's voice changed, not louder, but stripped down to something that made even the writers listen. Put that down. Caleb looked at the sweatshirt, at the faded letters, at the old life it represented, and smiled. This is what you are hiding behind? He tossed it onto the dusty ground near the porch steps. A dead man's shirt. Evelyn walked to it, bent slowly, and picked it up with both hands. Dust clung to the fabric. For the first time since Caleb had arrived, her eyes shone with tears. But when she stood, her back was straight. Her silence was not weakness. It was the last door closing. You have your final answer, she said. Leave. Caleb's face darkened because even that had not broken her. He lunged verbally because there was nothing else left to do that would not expose him completely. No. You are going to sign. He grabbed the folder from Preston, slapped the papers onto the hood of his truck, and shoved the pen across the top page. Right here. Today. Or every problem you have had so far is going to feel polite. The cameras caught it all. The forced entry. The broken chain. The threat. Preston's presence. Dale's recording. The grave. The sweatshirt. The demand for a signature. Evelyn looked at the papers, then at Caleb. You should have left when I asked. Caleb's writers laughed again, but not with the same confidence. The air had changed around them, though they did not know why. From somewhere behind the barn, a faint click sounded, too soft for most people to hear. Near the tree line, Daniel sent a two-word message to the group. All recorded. Owen, in town, forwarded the live archive to Agent Rachel Kim. Ben, on the county road, watched two state vehicles turn off the highway miles away, still distant but moving. Jack stepped into the shadowed hallway, his face calm, his eyes fixed on Caleb through the open door. Evelyn did not look back. She only folded Thomas's sweatshirt over her arm, held it against her chest, and stared at the man who had mistaken restraint for surrender. Caleb pointed at the papers one last time. Sign, or find out what happens after mercy runs out. Evelyn's reply was barely above a whisper, but every microphone caught it clearly. Mercy already did. The yard fell silent. Caleb did not understand the sentence. None of his men did. They thought they were still waiting for Evelyn Brooks to break. They did not know the breaking point had already passed. They did not know Thomas's final mission had just moved from patience to action. And they did not know that beyond the porch, beyond the barn, beyond the tree line, the men they had failed to see were done letting Caleb Mercer write the next move. For 3 seconds after Evelyn said mercy already did, nobody in the yard moved. Caleb Mercer stood with one hand on the papers, the pen lying across the signature line, his mouth curling into a grin because he still believed silence belonged to him. He thought the old woman had reached the end of her courage. He thought the riders behind him, the broken gate behind them, and Preston Vale's folder on the hood of the truck meant power had already chosen a side. Then the porch light flickered once. Not off. Not broken. Just one clean pulse of brightness above the doorway, followed by a soft electronic click from somewhere near the barn. Caleb's smile faltered. What was that? He snapped, turning toward Mason as if one of his own men had made the sound. Mason looked around the yard. Dale lowered his phone slightly. Preston Vale took one cautious step back from the truck, suddenly aware that the farm no longer felt empty. Evelyn remained where she was, Thomas's sweatshirt folded over her arm, her face calm in a way that made the bikers uneasy. Caleb pointed at the papers again, trying to drag the moment back under his control. I said sign. Before Evelyn could answer, a voice came from inside the farmhouse, low, steady, and close enough to make every rider turn toward the open door. She already answered you. Jack Holloway stepped out of the shadowed hallway and onto the porch. He was not wearing a uniform. There were no medals on his chest, no dramatic entrance, no raised weapon, nothing that should have frightened a dozen men who had spent years mistaking noise for strength. He wore jeans, work boots, and a plain dark shirt. But the way he walked changed the air. He did not hurry. He did not posture. He came down the porch steps like a man entering a room he had already studied from every angle. Caleb squinted at him, then forced a laugh. Who are you supposed to be? Another handyman? Jack stopped beside Evelyn, not in front of her, not shielding her like she was helpless, but standing with her like that was where Thomas had ordered him to be. Jack Holloway. The name meant nothing to Caleb at first. It meant something to Luke Tanner, whose eyes flicked toward the photograph visible inside the house. Preston Vale looked from Jack to Evelyn, sensing the balance of the meeting sliding away from contracts and into something he could not manage with careful language. Caleb recovered quickly. Well, Jack Holloway, this is private property business. Jack's eyes moved to the broken chain near the gate, then to the motorcycle spread across the driveway, then to the forced papers on the truck hood. That is not what the cameras show. Caleb's face tightened. You people keep talking about cameras like they scare me. Jack looked toward Dale's phone. That one should. Dale glanced at the screen in his own hand as if it had betrayed him. Then another voice came from the barn. So should the three over the porch. Marcus Reed stepped out of the barn doorway, wiping his hands on a cloth, the wrench still loose in his grip. He walked into the light with the same quiet control Jack carried, his eyes scanning the riders without anger, without fear, without uncertainty. From the tree line, Daniel Cross appeared next, moving from shadow into open ground so smoothly that several men jerked their heads toward him only after he was already visible. Ben Whitaker came through the gate from the road, closing it behind him with a fresh chain he had brought in one hand. Owen Price stepped from behind the old tractor shed, phone to his ear, his laptop bag over one shoulder. One by one, the men Caleb had not seen became impossible to ignore. The riders shifted, suddenly aware of spaces they had failed to check, angles they had never considered, exits that no longer felt like exits. Caleb stared at them, then barked out a laugh that did not reach his eyes. "This is your big surprise? 5 old guys?" Jack did not react. He bent, picked up the navy sweatshirt from Evelyn's arm with her permission, brushed the dust from the sleeve, and handed it back to her carefully. Then he looked at the oak tree where Thomas rested. Thomas Brooks saved every man standing on this property right now. The yard went still again, but this time the silence belonged to Jack. Evelyn lowered her eyes for a moment, and even the wind seemed to soften around the farmhouse. Caleb rolled his shoulders, trying to turn discomfort into contempt. "Good for him. Does not change the deed." "No," Owen said, stepping forward with his phone still connected. "The deed changed nothing because she owns the land outright. Mortgage released 6 years ago. Taxes current. No lien. No pending sale. No signed agreement. Everything you brought here today depends on intimidation." Preston's face went pale. "Who are you?" Owen looked at him. "The person who sent your email, your revised offer, your shell company records, and your proposed closing schedule to someone who understands federal fraud statutes better than you do." Preston's mouth opened, but no words came out. Caleb pointed at Owen. "You do not know what you are talking about." From Owen's phone, a woman's voice answered, crisp and professional. "Actually, he does." Caleb froze. Owen held the phone so the speaker carried across the yard. "Mr. Mercer, this is Special Agent Rachel Kim. I am listening to a live recording from Brooks Farm. I strongly suggest everyone present avoid making any further threats." The words moved through the riders like cold water. Mason looked toward the road. Dale lowered his phone completely. Preston whispered, "Federal." Caleb's face hardened, but his eyes betrayed the first crack of fear. He looked at the cameras, then at the men, then at Evelyn. "This is a setup." Evelyn's voice was soft. "No. This is documentation." Jack took one step toward the truck hood, picked up the pen Caleb had tried to force into Evelyn's hand, and placed it on top of the folder. "You were given chances to leave." Marcus lifted a small tablet and turned the screen toward the yard. Caleb saw himself on video at the gate, saying bad luck gets expensive. The clip changed to the diner, where he mocked Evelyn's grief. Then the intercom threat. Then the forced entry. Then Preston standing beside him as Mason cut the chain. Then Caleb by the oak tree. Each clip was short, clear, undeniable. Nobody had to explain what they meant. Caleb understood because his own voice explained it for him. His jaw moved, but no defense came. Jack's calm was worse than shouting. It gave Caleb nothing to push against. "You thought she was alone because Thomas was buried under that tree," Jack said. "You thought a widow meant an easy target. You thought the town would stay quiet, the deputy would look away, and your friends in suits would clean up the paperwork afterward." He paused, letting every word settle. "Thomas knew men like you existed. That is why he made one final request before he died." Caleb tried to sneer. "What request?" Jack turned slightly, not taking his eyes off him. Marcus, Owen, Daniel, and Ben stood evenly across the yard, not surrounding for spectacle, simply present in all the places Caleb had assumed were empty. Evelyn stood at the porch, holding the sweatshirt now, her tears gone, her dignity untouched. Jack's answer came quietly. Her. That single word landed harder than any threat Caleb had made all week. Luke looked down. Preston took another step away from Caleb as if distance could separate him from the evidence. Mason's face lost color. Caleb stared at Evelyn as if seeing her for the first time, not as a weak woman, not as a signature, not as land to be taken, but as the center of a promise that had been waiting patiently for him to reveal exactly what he was. In the distance, sirens began to rise, faint at first, then clearer along the county road. Caleb looked toward the broken gate and saw Ben standing beside it. He looked toward the barn and saw Marcus. He looked toward the trees and saw Daniel. He looked toward the porch and saw Jack. The power in the yard had changed hands without anyone raising their voice. Evelyn stepped down one stair, enough for the cameras to catch her face fully. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "you came here to make me sign away my home. Instead, you signed your own name to every crime you thought nobody could prove." Caleb's mouth opened, but all his confidence had nowhere left to stand. The engines were silent now. The riders were silent. Even Preston Vale, with all his polished words and expensive shoes, had gone still beside the truck. As the first state vehicle appeared beyond the road, lights flashing against the late afternoon dust, Evelyn looked past Caleb to the oak tree and held Thomas's sweatshirt close. The farm was not empty. It had never been empty. It had been guarded by cameras, by truth, by records, by witnesses, and by 5 men who had carried a dead man's promise farther than Caleb Mercer could ever have imagined. The first state patrol cruiser stopped outside the broken gate with its lights washing red and blue across the dust, and for the first time since Caleb Mercer had entered Brooks Farm, none of his men laughed. 2 more vehicles followed within seconds, then a dark federal sport utility vehicle with plain plates, then a county supervisor's car that made Deputy Harlan's face go pale the moment he stepped out behind it. Caleb turned toward the road as if the sight offended him. "This is a land dispute," he shouted, trying to make his voice fill the yard the way it had before. But the yard had stopped belonging to his voice. The engines were off. The cameras were still recording. Preston Vale stood frozen beside the truck with the folder clutched in one hand, and Dale Riggs's phone, the one he had used to record Evelyn's humiliation, now showed his own fear reflected in the black screen. A state police captain named Teresa Grant walked through the gate first, her hand resting near her belt, her eyes moving across the scene with professional calm. Behind her came Special Agent Rachel Kim in a navy blazer, phone still in one hand, her expression controlled but sharp enough to cut through every lie before it left a mouth. She looked at Evelyn first, not Caleb, not Preston, not the riders. "Mrs. Brooks, are you physically all right?" Evelyn stood on the porch with Thomas's sweatshirt folded against her chest. "Yes, Agent Kim." Rachel nodded once, then turned to Caleb. "Caleb Mercer, step away from the truck." Caleb lifted both hands in mock innocence. "You people are making a mistake. She invited us here to discuss a sale." Owen Price tapped the tablet screen and the porch audio played through a small speaker, clear enough for everyone to hear Caleb's own voice ordering Mason to cut the gate chain, clear enough to hear Evelyn tell them to leave, clear enough to hear Preston say he hoped to avoid escalation while remaining beside the men who had just entered without permission. Rachel did not raise her voice. "That was your first problem. Your second problem is that we have recordings from previous calls, video from the diner, footage from the intercom, statements from witnesses, and financial records connecting your intimidation efforts to land acquisitions around Blackridge Lake." Caleb looked at Preston, and Preston immediately looked away. That single movement told every rider in the yard that the men with clean shirts were not going to save the men in leather. Captain Grant motioned to 2 troopers. "Secure the riders. Nobody leaves until we identify everyone and collect statements." Mason Pike started to argue, but Marcus Reed took one slow step aside, revealing the barn camera pointed directly at him, and Mason's anger drained into calculation. He put his hands where the troopers could see them. Dale tried to delete something from his phone. Daniel Cross saw the movement from 20 feet away and said, "That device is evidence." Dale froze. A trooper took the phone, placed it in an evidence bag, and marked the time. Luke Tanner looked sick, his eyes fixed on the oak tree where Caleb had disrespected Thomas's grave. "I did not touch anything," he said quickly. "I told him to leave it alone." Rachel looked at him. "Then you will want to say that clearly in a recorded statement." The words moved through the group like a door opening. Men who had spent years protected by silence suddenly understood that silence might now protect only Caleb. Evelyn watched without satisfaction. She had thought, in the hardest moments, that justice would feel like fire. Instead, it felt like air returning to a room that had been locked too long. Caleb saw Luke speaking to a trooper and snapped, "Keep your mouth shut." Captain Grant turned immediately. "Mr. Mercer, do not intimidate a witness in front of state police." Jack Holloway stood beside the porch rail, arms at his sides, his face unreadable. Caleb glared at him. "You think you won?" Jack's answer was quiet. This was never a contest. Rachel stepped closer to Caleb with a folder Owen had prepared from the archive. "You are being detained pending charges related to criminal trespass, coercion, attempted extortion, property damage, witness intimidation, and conspiracy connected to forced land sales. Additional charges may follow after we review the financial records and prior complaints." Caleb's face reddened. "You cannot prove conspiracy." Owen held up Preston's final opportunity email. "Your friend helped." Preston finally found his voice. "I was acting in a corporate capacity. I did not authorize violence or threats." Evelyn looked at him then, and the quiet force in her eyes made his explanation shrink. "You stood beside the men who cut my gate. You brought closing documents to a home whose owner had already refused you. You watched him walk toward my husband's grave and did not leave." Preston swallowed. Rachel took the folder from his hand, slid it into an evidence bag, and nodded to another agent. "Mr. Vale, your company devices and communications will be subpoenaed. Blackridge Land Partners is now part of this investigation." The polished man who had arrived believing paperwork could wash dirt from his hands suddenly looked very much like a man standing in mud. Then Deputy Harlan tried to disappear. He had parked near the road, half hidden behind a state vehicle, pretending to speak into his radio. Captain Grant called his name before he made it 3 steps. "Deputy Harlan, stay where you are." Harlan turned, forcing a thin smile. "Captain, I was just responding to the call." Evelyn felt Jack glance at her, but she kept her eyes on Harlan. Rachel opened another file on Owen's tablet. "Deputy, we have multiple complaints from Mrs. Brooks that were either incomplete, delayed, or never entered properly into the county system. We also have 2 prior landowner complaints involving the Iron Vultures closed by you despite available witness names. Agent Kim has also received financial records suggesting irregular deposits into an account associated with you." Harlan's smile vanished. "Now wait a minute." Captain Grant removed the radio from his hand. "You are relieved of active duty pending internal investigation. Turn over your badge and service weapon." Harlan looked around as if searching for someone in the town to look away for him the way he had always looked away for Caleb. This time, no one did. He surrendered the badge with shaking fingers, and Evelyn felt the full weight of that small metal object leaving his hand. It was not revenge. It was proof that neglect had consequences too. Caleb was still arguing when the troopers moved in. "This is ridiculous. I know my rights." Rachel's voice stayed level. "Then you know you have the right to remain silent." The cuffs closed around his wrists in the same yard where he had tried to force Evelyn to sign away her home. He looked toward the riders for loyalty and found men studying the ground. He looked toward Preston and found a corporate man already separating himself. He looked toward Harlan and found a deputy without a badge. Finally, he looked at Evelyn. "You set me up." Evelyn came down the porch steps slowly until she stood a few feet away from him, still holding Thomas's sweatshirt. "No, Mr. Mercer. I gave you chances to leave. You chose the rest in front of witnesses." Caleb's jaw worked, but there was nothing left to threaten. The farm had heard him. The cameras had seen him. The people he had counted on had either failed him or begun saving themselves. As the troopers led him toward the cruiser, his boots dragged through the same dust where he had thrown Thomas's sweatshirt. The image was not lost on anyone. Mason Pike and Dale Riggs were detained next, their phones, motorcycles, and vests photographed and logged. Luke Tanner gave a statement admitting Caleb had planned to pressure Evelyn, damage property, and scare her into signing. Paul the feed driver arrived with a written statement and handed it directly to Captain Grant. Heather from the hardware store sent her video to Agent Kim before the sun went down. Linda Carver from the diner confirmed Caleb's public threats. Mr. Walter Hayes, leaning on his cane after Ben drove him back from the clinic, stood at the gate and told a trooper what he had seen on the road. One by one, the pieces Caleb had dismissed as too small to matter became the structure that held him in place. By early evening, Rachel Kim stood beside Evelyn at the porch while evidence technicians photographed the cut chain, the truck hood where the force documents had been placed, the tire tracks, the cameras, and the disturbed ground near the oak tree. "Your deed is clear," Rachel said. "There is no enforceable sale, no pending transfer, and no legal claim by Blackridge Land Partners. I will make sure the county recorder flags any attempted filing connected to this property." Evelyn nodded, absorbing the words slowly. "So they cannot take it? Not through this scheme." Rachel glanced toward the road where Caleb sat in the back of a cruiser. "And after today, they are going to have a hard time pretending this was business." Jack stepped away from the porch and walked to the oak tree. Without ceremony, he straightened the small flag Caleb had nudged aside. Marcus repaired the gate chain before the last cruiser left. Daniel copied the footage for investigators and sealed the original drive. Owen sent the full archive to Rachel's secure link. Ben helped Walter back to his porch and promised to check on him in the morning. The Iron Vultures left Brooks Farm without their leader, without their confidence, and without the protection of the silence they had depended on for years. As Caleb's cruiser rolled past the sign at the end of the driveway, Evelyn watched from the porch. Brooks Farm still carried red paint stains, a crooked mailbox, a broken chain, and the memory of what had happened there. But it was still hers. Her name was still on the deed. Her husband's grave was still under the oak. Her dignity had not been signed away. And for the first time since the first engine had slowed outside her gate, the men who had tried to make her feel powerless were the ones being driven away while she remained standing on her own land. The next morning, Blackridge woke up to a silence it had not earned yet. For years, the town had treated the Iron Vultures like bad weather, something unpleasant but unavoidable, something people complained about only after doors were locked and curtains were closed. But by sunrise, everyone knew Caleb Mercer had not ridden away from Brooks Farm. He had been taken from it in the back of a state patrol cruiser, and the difference mattered. At Miller's Feed and Hardware, customers who had once lowered their voices around men in leather now spoke openly beside the register. Heather printed her phone video and gave a full statement, then taped a small sign near the counter that read, "We support Brooks Farm." At the diner, the same tables that had gone quiet while Caleb mocked Evelyn were crowded with people repeating what they should have said earlier. Some sounded ashamed. Some sounded relieved. A few tried to pretend they had always known Caleb would go too far, but Evelyn did not need their excuses. The truth was already doing what fear had failed to do, it was moving from person to person, making silence harder to defend. Within 48 hours, Agent Rachel Kim's office had received 9 additional statements from landowners around Blackridge Lake. Earl Dawson brought records from the garage fire that had forced him to sell. The Thompson family, who had moved their bait shop to Alabama, joined a video call with Rachel and described weeks of broken windows, late-night engines, and ignored complaints. A widow named Marlene Ortiz handed over photographs of cut fencing and a purchase offer that had arrived the day after her cattle wandered loose. Each story sounded different on the surface, but underneath was the same pattern: pressure, fear, a low offer, a slow deputy, and paperwork waiting at the end, like the whole thing had been legal all along. Owen Price organized the evidence into a timeline so clear that even county officials could not pretend confusion. Blackridge Land Partners lost its development permit before the end of the week. Preston Vale was suspended by the company first, then named in the investigation when emails showed he had known more than he admitted. The county commission scheduled an emergency public hearing after reporters from Atlanta arrived asking why so many elderly and minority landowners had filed complaints that went nowhere. Deputy Harlan's badge remained locked in an evidence room while internal investigators reopened every complaint he had closed involving the Iron Vultures. The sheriff stood before cameras outside the courthouse and promised reform in the careful voice of a man who had discovered accountability only after it became public. New procedures were announced. Every property intimidation complaint would require a supervisor review, all body camera footage had to be uploaded before the end of each shift, and land development complaints involving vulnerable owners would be referred to the state attorney's office instead of being buried in local files. Evelyn watched the announcement from her kitchen table with Jack Holloway standing near the window and Walter Hayes sitting across from her, both of them drinking coffee that had gone cold. She did not smile when the sheriff spoke. Words were easy. She knew that now more than ever. But when Walter reached across the table and touched her hand, his eyes wet behind his glasses, she understood that something real had shifted anyway. "You did not just save your farm," he said quietly. "You gave the rest of us our voices back." Evelyn looked out toward the field where Marcus and Ben were helping repair the last stretch of damaged fence. "No," she said. "The voices were always there. People just needed to know somebody would listen." That Saturday, more than 30 neighbors came to Brooks Farm without being asked. Heather arrived with paint and 2 brushes. Paul the feed driver brought 2 full pallets of feed his supervisor donated after learning why the delivery had been blocked. Earl Dawson came with a toolbox and fixed the porch rail Thomas had always meant to reinforce. Marlene Ortiz brought peach cobbler and a folder of documents she no longer wanted hidden in her closet. Even people who had been silent in the diner showed up with gloves, nails, lumber, or shame pressed into the corners of their faces. Evelyn accepted the help without making them kneel in apology. She had no interest in turning guilt into another kind of performance. The work mattered more. By late afternoon, the Brooks Farm sign stood clean and white again at the road, the red stain sanded away, the letters repainted carefully by Heather's steady hand. Children from the neighboring farms carried water bottles to the workers. Walter sat beneath the pecan tree and told stories about Thomas fixing half the county for free. Jack and the others stayed mostly in the background, repairing, lifting, carrying, never presenting themselves as saviors. When people tried to thank them too loudly, Jack only nodded toward Evelyn. "Thank her," he said. "She kept the record." That evening, as the sun settled low over the pasture, Evelyn found another envelope tucked inside Thomas's wooden box, hidden beneath the cloth lining she had not thought to lift before. Her name was written on it in the same steady hand. She opened it at the kitchen table while the last volunteers loaded their trucks outside. Inside was a short note and an old photograph of Thomas standing at the farm gate, smiling the way he smiled only when he thought nobody was taking pictures. The note read, "Eve, if they ever make you feel small, remember this land never made me proud because it was mine. It made me proud because you made it a home. You were never the woman behind me. You were the reason I came home." Evelyn held the paper for a long time, the sound of hammers and soft voices drifting through the open window. The payoff had not erased what Caleb had done. It had not restored every night of sleep or removed every scar from the town's memory. But it had changed what happened next. People who had once watched from behind curtains now stood in open fields. Complaints once ignored were being reopened. Policies once treated as paperwork were becoming protection. And Brooks Farm, the place Caleb Mercer had tried to turn into a warning, had become something else entirely, proof that when one person refuses to disappear quietly, an entire community can remember how to stand. 1 month later, Brooks Farm sounded like itself again. Not perfect, not untouched, but alive in the way honest places are alive after surviving a storm. The repaired gate opened smoothly at sunrise. The horses grazed near the west pasture without flinching at every distant engine. The porch rail no longer wobbled beneath Evelyn's hand. The white sign by the road stood clean under a new coat of paint, the words Brooks Farm brighter than they had looked in years. Evelyn walked the property slowly that morning with a cup of coffee in one hand and Thomas's old navy sweatshirt over her shoulders, not because she was cold, but because some things did not have to be useful to be necessary. The farm still carried memory in small places. A patch of newer gravel where the cruisers had stopped. Fresh boards on the barn where Caleb's men had tried to make fear look like weather. A stronger chain on the gate. Cameras that now blinked quietly from their corners, not as symbols of fear, but as reminders that truth deserved witnesses. At the oak tree, Evelyn knelt and brushed a few dry leaves from Thomas's marker. The small flag stood straight again. For a while, she said nothing. She listened to the wind move across the pasture and the distant sound of Walter Hayes's old radio finally working after Owen fixed it. Then she touched the stone with 2 fingers. "Your boys came," she whispered. "Just like you said they would." Her voice trembled, but it did not break. She told him about the neighbors repainting the sign, about Heather speaking at the county hearing, about Paul bringing feed without charging delivery, about Earl Dawson getting his case reopened, about Deputy Harland losing the badge he had treated like a shield for cowardice. She told him Blackridge Land Partners had withdrawn its lake project while federal investigators sorted through the money trail. She told him Caleb Mercer was no longer a shadow over the county road, only a man waiting for court dates, lawyers, and the consequences of his own recorded words. "I thought justice would feel louder," Evelyn said softly. "But it feels more like breathing." Behind her, near the driveway, Jack Holloway and the others loaded the last of their bags into their vehicles. They had stayed longer than they planned, always finding one more thing to repair, one more camera angle to test, one more excuse not to leave the woman Thomas had trusted them to protect. Marcus had fixed the barn door. Daniel had walked the fence line every morning. Ben had helped Walter install a new porch light. Owen had organized Evelyn's files into labeled folders so no official could ever again pretend the record was confusing. Jack had said the least and watched the most. Now he stood by the gate with a small black device in his palm. When Evelyn walked back from the oak tree, he handed it to her. "It is a direct alert," he said. "Press it, and all 5 of us know." Evelyn looked down at it, then up at him. "Jack, you do not have to keep guarding me forever." His expression softened in a way that made him look, for a moment, like the younger man in Thomas's photograph. "With respect, ma'am, that order did not come from you." Evelyn smiled then, a real smile, quiet but whole. She closed her fingers around the device and placed it in her coat pocket. "Then I suppose I should stop arguing with Navy men. Thomas said you never did." Thomas exaggerated when it suited him. Jack laughed under his breath, and for the first time, the sound did not feel like grief stepping around a wound. It felt like life making room for itself again. One by one, the men said goodbye. No speeches. No dramatic promises. Just firm hands, lowered eyes at the oak tree, and the kind of respect that did not need to announce itself. When their trucks finally rolled down the driveway, Evelyn stood beside the gate and watched until the last one disappeared beyond the bend. She was alone on the farm again, but alone no longer meant abandoned. It meant trusted with the quiet. It meant strong enough to remain. As evening settled over Blackridge, Evelyn walked back to the porch, turned on the light, and looked across the fields Thomas had loved. The sky burned gold behind the barn, and the repaired wind chime beside the door rang softly in the breeze. Caleb Mercer had believed power was noise, numbers, threats, and fear. He had believed a widow's silence meant weakness. He had believed a dead man could leave nothing behind but a grave. He was wrong about all of it. Thomas Brooks had left love. He had left discipline. He had left proof that honor does not end when a life does. And Evelyn, standing tall on the porch of the home they built together, understood the lesson better than anyone. Some people are protected by money. Some by titles. Some by badges. But the strongest protection in the world is the kind earned through loyalty, truth, and a promise that refuses to die. Brooks Farm remained where it had always been, beneath the open Georgia sky, no longer a target, no longer a warning, but a living reminder that dignity can be threatened, delayed, and tested, yet still rise at sunset with its name intact.